I did all this work about 6 months ago, and I let it sit for 6 months, and then I came back to it a few days ago after, the acceptance and all that, and I said, oh my God, there's so much I need to add, there's so much I need to take out, and I got sick, and so I didn't get a chance to really do too much revision, but at any rate, I'll try and explain as best as I can for the people without a computer science background what's going on. There's an attempt in here to sort of take a new area of mathematics and apply it to outstanding problems in the cybersecurity field. So we have to start out with, what do we mean by security? And this is an issue that actually, it's surprising that the computer science and information science and IT community, they're not very precise quite often. You look in textbooks, on these subjects. Security is rarely ever defined as one precise notion. It's a relative notion, right? So, for instance, this computer can, whenever you turn it on and you try to access the desktop, it can be secure from you entering it, okay? But that doesn't mean that you couldn't take the server that supports it, right, and hack it and throw everybody off the server, okay? So security from whom? Security from what? Okay? It's a relative notion, right? It's relative to hardware, your computational resources, the background of the people who, are trying to exploit whatever vulnerabilities you have, how many vulnerabilities you have in the first place. But it's also a relational notion, right? Secure from whom, from what. And this led me to think about formalizing the notion of security, whatever notion we have, because there's various notions just in the cybersecurity community of various sort of sub-notions of security. They all could be formulated within one, generic relational framework that exploits the techniques of graph theory and some other related areas. So I also have to tell you something about formal security, okay? So there's security, general security in the cybersecurity field, and there's formal security, which is more concerned with coming up with a mathematically precise definition of security for a given domain, okay? And so that definition is going to vary depending on the domain. The precision is going to change a lot, right? What techniques you employ, what's your mathematics? What's your what are you trying to model? What does your domain look like? It's going to vary depending on the domain and what you accept. What's the vocabulary like? All these things. Okay, so one preeminent approach, okay, in the formal security field is say, well, look, we have these problems in cybersecurity, so all we have to do is find some convenient logical formalism, logic meaning from mathematical logic, okay, and we encode it into this formalism, we, play some games with it, and then boom, we're done, okay? And usually these encodings, all right, this formal trickery is done with respect to a given automated verification system. So the idea is that you take your problem, you formalize it, you feed it to a machine, and if the machine accepts it and outputs valid, you're good to go. And you publish your paper, and it's wonderful. You've impressed about 10 different people in your mini community, okay? And there are several examples of this. In fact, there's so many examples. I mean, I couldn't even begin to practically enumerate them. So if your interest is in, designing, verifying protocols, okay, security protocols, there's like dozens of logical formalisms just for that. If you want to model continuous communications between cellular devices, okay, or GPS or something like this, they have formalisms for that. You know, an example that I studied last semester with Dr. Bachak was the Dunning cryptographer's protocol, which actually, despite the name, uses no cryptography. But it's basically it's a cryptography-less protocol, which is nonetheless secure, and which is provably secure within the framework of epistemic temporal logic. So, of course, the formal logic approaches to security design or verifying security security properties are limited, obviously. Okay, the question of whether a given system X or a given formula X has property Y is going to boil down to three things: representational taste, decidability, and tractability. They're all interconnected. They're all equally important. This is something I learned last semester, is that you can't focus on just one without sacrificing the other two. And in computer science, you can't, these two are probably more important than this, actually, for various reasons, which I can, if you're curious to ask, want to know about, I can explain later. But the representation is how you choose to represent your problem, okay? You can, oftentimes people can, scholars working in the same area can represent the same problem in different ways, They can represent the same problem with different formalisms, and sometimes they arrive at equivalent results, right? Sometimes the formalism itself is a limitation, right? Decidability is the question of whether a given whether there exists for, a formula. So this problem that you've encoded into a formula, okay, is there an algorithm which says whether that formula is true, essentially, in a finite number of steps? Oftentimes, this question is the most important question of all, okay, because there are a lot of problems which, when you look at them, a lot of security properties, which when you try to put them through the formal logic analysis, they turn out to be undecidable. In other words, you'll feed them to the machine, and the machine will keep cycling. You'll come back to it in a couple days, and you'll see that it keeps going through essentially every single possible scenario. It keeps testing the formula, but it's not going to ever return true or false. It'll just keep going, right? And so you end up not knowing within that formal representation system whether your problem is solvable. That's not nice at all. No one likes that. And if you try if you're trying to defend the formal approach to cybersecurity to other cybersecurity professionals, or God forbid, policy people or something like this, okay, they will not like this, right? This is they'd say, well, okay, forget the formal approach. The problem is, of course, that the formal approach is very precise, and it gives you, a lot to work with, right? It gives you, whenever there is an answer, it gives you a precise answer, okay, within a finite number of steps. But yeah, there's these problems. The biggest one, besides the undecidability issue, is the state space explosion problem. So let's say your problem is decidable. Okay, let's say that you input the formula into the machine, and the machine is going to return an answer. It's going to return true or false. But your formula is, say, I don't know, n subformula long, right? In which case, that means you have 2 to the n formulas, okay, to consider. So 2 to the n cases to consider, right? And that is an exponentially large, essentially exponentially large consideration, okay? So that's what we call state space explosion. The also not nice, because ideally when you look at a given property, you want to know when it, you want to know it holds or fails to hold in a very short time. But if you have to search through 2 to the n, cases, that can take a very long time to do. Okay. So there are two main approaches to this within the formal logic camp. Okay, you can either devise ingenious mathematics to reduce the size of the state space. Okay, so it's the equivalent of saying, okay, here's your tree that is 2 to the n long, okay, and then chopping down the tree, okay, or chopping down the right branches of the tree, okay, and just, you're not blind when you're doing it, but it's almost like, you kind of are blind because you're just picking out 2 branches or 3 branches or 4 or however many you deem necessary to succeed in the endeavor of finding the true formula. Okay, or you can look for specific algorithms or heuristics that might speed up the search. So instead of cutting down entire branches of the tree or removing entire branches or trees, what you end up doing is you shorten the length of the entire tree, okay, via some algorithm or heuristic. Okay. But there's still more problems, right? So, okay, let's suppose you've done all that. Well, in the security world, there's still problems of modeling the active attacker. So the active attacker, as opposed to the passive attacker, and this is something that I think only cybersecurity people would know beforehand, is that, the passive attacker looks at the resources you have. So they hack your system, okay, but they don't mess around with it. They just observe what you're doing, okay? They take notes, whatever, okay? The active attacker hacks your system, okay, and they exploit it. They basically change it in some way. They change the resources of your machine in some way. Okay, at the moment, in the formal cybersecurity field, there's no way to formally model that. And there's all sorts of reasons why. Part of that has to do with adding new operators. So when you might, one approach is to add a new operator. If you add a new operator, that means more than likely you got to change the semantics, which means the length of the tree is going to get longer, and nobody wants to do that. My God, So why don't we say, okay, forget, the formal logical approach, and try a different area of mathematics, discrete mathematics, okay, nonetheless, as a paradigm for dealing with formal security issues. Most mathematics is focused around pure and simple mathematics. It's focused around notions of functions, sine of x, limit of a sequence, the notion of a bijection, all these things, okay? Just think of, all the mathematics you've ever taken in your life. It doesn't need to be much, but in every case, you've always thought of functions. You've always learned to manipulate functions, which is true, but all of these notions are actually relations, right? In set theory, you can define a function as simply a many-to-one relation. Any kind of function you can conceive of is actually a relation, right? And that's great because as it happens in computer science, everything is a relation, right? When we think of networks, right? Networks are just graphs, which are just collections of relations ordered in certain ways. When we think of databases, databases are simply collections of relations. When we think of distributed systems, relations, ontologies, collections of relations, and so on, okay? Relations are everywhere. So it's not just math, it's also in computer science, right? And it's arguably essential to the foundation of computer science that we have an understanding of relations like this. So it's foundational for computer science, foundational for mathematics. Why shouldn't we use it for cybersecurity issues, right? Why should I have to feed these formulae through a machine that might not ever return an answer to me anyway, when I can just model these scenarios in, a more amenable formalism, which is relational. So now the question is coming up with the right graph-centric or relation-centric formalism for this activity. Yeah. So in what follows, I present sort of an embryonic kind of framework as briefly as I can. 5 minutes? Okay. There's not a whole lot here, so. Okay, so basically, don't get too crazy about this. This is just, you know, you have a collection of agents. These agents could be machines, they could be humans, they could be anything you like them to be, okay? Um, you have a collection of agents, you have a collection of relations that exist between these agents, okay? And we denote that as graph G. So this notion of a graph, by the way, is not, try and divorce this idea from the Cartesian coordinate system type graph you guys are probably used to, with like slope, how you calculate slope and things like this. So that is one notion of graph. This is the computer science notion of graph, okay, which depicts general relations, not just ones that could be plotted on the real number line, okay? So yeah, so it's just collections of agents and relations that exist between them. And I say, well, look, these relations can be attack relations, okay? And so we have a definition for an attack, which, is there for you. We put attack is one, if and only if there is a graph G with agents A, B, relation attack such that A attacks B, blah, 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 and zero otherwise, okay? And you can define it recursively, and you can build other relations on top of this, okay? So you can define vulnerability, exploitable, all these different things. And if people in the cybersecurity community have objections to these, or they have wanted to suggest improvements for their domain, I'm open to that. I'm not particularly committed to everything here, And so there's all these very nice definitions that build on one another, and it's a very general framework. One can add more specificity. One can take some away. It's intended to be like that because for different domains, you're going to want to emphasize different features. You might want to take some out. You might, replace one with another. Relations together with the conditions you attach are complete. Yeah. So if you want to add, if you want to emphasize something, or you want to say something very specific about your graph, or the a collection of agents that you have within that graph, all you need to do is tack on a very specific condition that the relation has to obey. Or you can add predicates on top of the collection of agents you have if you don't want it to be a dual two-way relation. So anyway, by playing around with the conditions on relations and cardinality, how many agents there are in a given graph, one can obtain new graphs. Alternatively, by traversing the edges of the graph, one can learn the conditions, what conditions the distinguished attack relations obey. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to skip that. I have some examples, but since I'm under the gun. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So there's a connection. I made a connection here between, so you have a graph and you have the edges that go along the graph. And depending on whether a given relation holds or doesn't, you assign 1 or 0 as per the earlier definitions, right? So by doing that, you get a Boolean matrix for free, which means that this procedure will always return to you true or false. You're never going to have those undecidable cases. So if you were to write a program which took, these graphs, these little finite things as input, they'd always return true or false. And I expect even if you were to extend it to the infinite case, since we've done it recursively, we'd have the same feature, okay? It'd still be decidable. So in that case, in my opinion, we're already better off than the formal logical approach. And we also have two ways of discerning whether two structures are identical or not, which is either through looking at the matrices, which determine the graph, or looking at the graphs, and they're defining a function of isomorphism between them. And the graphs, as I said, the graphs can determine the matrices, or the matrices can determine the graphs. Either way, it's like effectively you're looking at the same structure either way. More work, we could rank threats. that's actually, I think, the most important next thing for me to do is to find a way to rank the threats within the graph system. That would be nice, kind of like page rank, or something like this. How many things are attacking this one agent? Well, I would say that if everybody else in the graph is attacking that agent, that probably means that it's the most vulnerable, right? So intuitions like that need to be respected, and I need to find a way to formalize those. Anyway, any questions? I'm just about done. So. Right.
If someone wants to ask an educated question, go ahead. I'll ask a non-educated question if I do. So years ago, so sociologists, I'm going to try to draw a parallel and gosh. So sociologists, let's say, are always trying to say, how do we define social class? And they think, what are the variables to define social class? For a while, decades ago, people would look at a small set, a town of 1,000 people, just look at who actually communicated with who. Where were their relationships, if you will?
Okay.
And then they started to look at what were the similarities within the people of those clusters.
Okay.
Given people in the same social class tend to interact with each other.
True.
We start defining social class by those relations. And sometimes there's this real anomalous, weird connections, if you will.
Right.
Could a model be to some degree?
That's exactly. Yeah. So you start superficially, right? Just like as you described. Start superficially with the most general observations you can find, which would typically be classified by your axioms, right? And then from there you start churning out theorems, i.e., more specific facts. Okay, and along the same vein, right? It's just and when you expand the graph. Okay, when you add more characters, when you add more agents and more connections, it's surprising, but you will find more interesting information. So these people are collaborating. Clear, when just adding one more or two more agents can help you discern that fact, whereas, subtracting them out obviously wouldn't reveal that. There are cases like that all over the place. So I don't see why not. Yeah. Okay. I'm done.